Nicholas Kristof's biography is printed in your program, so rather than recite his many accomplishments listed there, I thought I'd introduce him in a slightly different fashion through a story. 3 years ago, the United States declared the humanitarian crisis in Darfur a genocide. With more than 200,000 presumed dead and 2.5 million Sudanese children, women, and men displaced, it's a region that desperately needs the attention and support of the global community. The newly released film, Darfur Now, follows the journey of 6 people working in different ways to resolve the conflict in Sudan. One of the 6, activist Adam Sterling, was a college student at UCLA, trying to find a major and waiting tables before he became involved in fighting for peace in Darfur. A few years ago, he began lobbying for legislation that would keep California state funds out of Sudan as a way of putting pressure on the government in Khartoum. He started his uphill battle with a goal: to get 2,941 flyers signed, a figure that coincided with the bill number on his proposed legislation. In only a few weeks, he had over 4,000 signatures. Eventually, his bill succeeded and was signed into law by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Since then, Adam has had other successes around the country. Similar laws have now been passed in over 12 other states. So how did Adam Sterling, a college student, get involved in this crusade? Here's what he said in an interview. For me, it started with a story. It was a story written by Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, sent to me by a friend in 2004. In the column, Kristof described visiting one of the refugee camps and speaking with a young mother. And he asked this young mother, he said, "Every time you send your daughter out to collect firewood, she is raped. Why don't you send your son?" And the mother's response was, "If I send my son, he'll be killed. If I send my daughter, she'll only be raped." Adam continued, "That type of forced decision," he said, "I had nothing to compare to it in my own life. It shattered me to the core, and from that point forward, this is all I have been doing." Adam Sterling was not an activist at the time he read Nicholas Kristof's column. He was a college student. He wasn't a guy looking around for a cause. He was a guy trying to figure out what his major was going to be and what he was going to do after he got out of school. But in that moment, he was profoundly moved to a greater consciousness by what he learned, and Nicholas Kristof was his source of illumination. Marked forever by Kristof's words, he moved to action. He took that first step. That's what Nicholas Kristof does for us. He connects us to these unspeakable atrocities on a personal level, and he dares us to act. He takes a crisis of enormous magnitude and scale and humanizes it, turning it into something people can understand and relate to on basic human terms. He makes us look into the eyes of people who have lost family members, entire villages, friends, loved ones. We hear the voices of people whom without him would have no voice. For too many of us, the problems of Africa still seem a world away, involving people who seem very different from us. As Americans, we too often use geographic distance and the distances of culture and economics as shields to excuse ignorance and inaction. We are inclined to turn away. What Nick Kristof does for me in his writing is shrink time and space. He brings things closer to us. He allows us to draw connections and compels us to turn our ignorance into outrage and our inaction into engagement. 2 weeks ago, when U.S. News and World Report named him one of America's top leaders, they said this: "As a columnist for the Times, Kristof is showing a new generation that journalists needn't just watch disasters unfold. They can also try to avert them by advocating for change." Kristof himself more modestly described his work in this way. He said, "We in the journalism business traditionally haven't been very good at covering things that happen every day. Malaria, AIDS, genocide. So I try to use my column a little bit to try to bring those things out of the background, front and center, and onto the breakfast table. And if I can make people spill their coffee, I'd like to do that." Please hold on to your coffee mugs and join me in wishing Nicholas Kristof a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. I must say that sounded suspiciously like a eulogy. especially in these kind of somber surroundings. I was sitting there and thinking, did I somehow walk into my own funeral by mistake? But I'm really delighted to be here, and this is an incredibly high-powered audience, and down to the 3 fifth graders right here, and so welcome to all of you. I think it really is important that we have this audience. I thank the Blank Foundation for bringing us here, because the reality is that if there is going to be an effort to address issues like genocide or issues like humanitarian needs in Africa, it's not going to emerge, as one might expect, from Washington, but rather from real America. And when I was saying that, I noticed some of you looking sort of surprised, leadership from Washington? Where would you get that idea? But the reality is, in fact, that's right. That, for example, on the issue of genocide, which is obviously near and dear to my heart, whether it was in 1915 Armenians being slaughtered, when Woodrow Wilson, for all of his idealism, looking the other way, or FDR during the Holocaust, refusing pleas to at least try to bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz, or the Clinton administration refusing to even use the word genocide during Rwanda for fear that then they might have to actually do something. There is a pretty consistent and bipartisan record, unfortunately, in refusing to take the lead. And to the extent that there has been effort to address these issues, it's come from the grassroots. There was actually some reason to think that with this administration, when Darfur began, that it might have been different. President Bush, shortly after he took office, was reading a report about how President Clinton had not done anything about Rwanda. And he famously scrawled in the margin of that, "Not on my watch." And for those of you who know those green Save Darfur armbands, I mean, that is the origin of that. And so you do get the sense that President Bush, at some intellectual level, really did aspire to do better than the Clinton administration, for example, had done. And I think that, in general, presidents and administrations go into office thinking that they are going to really make a difference on humanitarian causes, and then invariably they don't make headway unless there is a constituency out there pushing them for it. And that's your job. That's our job. Our elected leaders aspire in their hearts to do better, and they don't, or they can't, unless that leadership comes from the ground up. I'd like to cover a few of the issues, and I think maybe the most effective way of addressing them is to raise the objections that I think people sometimes articulate, but at least often feel about why we should be concerned with humanitarian concerns in Africa or with genocide in Darfur. And so let me try to raise some of those concerns that I think people feel, and give you what I think is the response that at least works for me. And a starting point is simply the question of why Africa? There are so many needs, including in this country. Shouldn't we address our own needs before we go gallivanting around the globe and address other people's? And I have a contest every year where I take a student with me and to Africa. And the first year I did that, I took a young woman from Mississippi who had grown up in poverty, and she very much felt that way. She was very skeptical of this whole notion of, why was jumping up and down about Africa. And then we got to one of the issues we were addressing was maternal health, maternal mortality. And we were in a little clinic in southeastern Cameroon talking to the doctor about maternal mortality, and we knew intellectually that 500,000 women a year die in childbirth or pregnancy in the developing world. And then, as we were talking to the doctor, it turned out that there was a woman in the next room she was from a village. She had 3 kids already, her 4th pregnancy. When she went into labor, labor was obstructed. She had a blocked cervix, and the midwife, after 2 days, had sat on her stomach. The uterus had ruptured. somebody in the village had taken her to the hospital on a motorcycle, and then the doctor had asked for $100 to remove the fetus, and the family didn't have $100. And there was such contempt as well from the medical staff for this woman because A, she was female, and B, she was poor, and C, she was rural, she was a villager, that even when we provided the $100 and when we gave blood, because the doctor said, well, anyway, she would need a blood transfusion if we were to operate, when we gave blood for that, then even so, he just went out the back way and went home, and we watched her die. And so this young woman I taken from Mississippi, she had remembered going without health insurance when she was growing up and the frustration of that. But she said, at least I could go to the emergency ward and people weren't dying right in the hospital because nobody would look at them. And it really is different. This year I took the Win-A-Trip winner to the place that is the site of the most lethal war since World War II. Anybody know what country that is? Congo, yeah. The Congo, it gets very little coverage, which probably is an indictment of what those of us in the news media do, but it's the most lethal conflict since World War II. Maybe roughly 5 million people have died there since 1998, and it obviously doesn't get coverage. And so we went to eastern Congo, which is still in huge turmoil. And at one point, we were in a camp for internally displaced people, and we asked about rape victims. And so one of the camp people introduced a woman who had been raped by the militias, which is a tool there, as in much of the world. It's become a weapon of war. And so we were interviewing her under one tree, and we wanted to give her some privacy. We didn't want anybody else clustering around. And we noticed that there was a group of women who were sort of forming, too close, maybe a dozen feet away. And so we tried to shoo them away a little bit. And they explained, we've all been raped. We want to tell our story too. And that it was so painful to see a situation like that where you have the people lining up to tell their stories. We met a woman called Cecily who she'd had 3 kids 2 years ago in a bout of unrest. The 2 elder children had starved to death. The youngest one was still nursing at the breast and so was able to get enough milk, and so Cecily was able to keep the baby alive. Then 2 months before we had arrived, her husband had been out trying to farm their plot, and one of these militias had gone out and killed him. After that, Cecily couldn't go out because of the risk into the fields to till their land or to harvest the crops, and nobody else in the village dared to either. And so her baby, the youngest child, was starving to death. It's an exceptionally painful way to die, and a slow motion way to die. And, so there certainly are problems here in this country. We need to address those issues of poverty, but there really is a difference between the humanitarian needs abroad in a place like Eastern Congo and those here, and we can do both at the same time. Now, I think another objection that people often have is that there's a sense, and again, this is one I think people feel more often than they articulate, but a sense that, look, it's too bad about Africa, but frankly, Africa's always a mess, always has been. What's the point of trying to, bail these people out? They'll just be at war again. It's hopeless. And my answer to that is very much shaped by having lived in Asia for much of my career. I lived in China for 7 years, and you look back at China, and for much of modern history, that's exactly what people said about China, that it was hopeless. And in fact, China in 1950 had a lower per capita income than it had had at the end of the Sung dynasty in 1290. And these days it's common to say that, well, China is booming because of its culture. Well, all those centuries when China was going downhill, everybody was writing it off, and they were saying, oh, it's because of its culture. And Bangladesh as well. Henry Kissinger famously referred to Bangladesh as a basket case. And in fact, if I can almost measure the moment when Bangladesh hit its low, because that's the moment that I chose to write an article saying that basically Bangladesh is more or less hopeless. And just at that moment, it picked up and improved. And in fact, I think Africa has already turned the corner. If you look at Africa's growth rates, this year it's going to grow at about 6%, which is more than double the economic growth rate of the U.S. You get some countries that have really been booming, and there are a lot of other needs in other places. But as governance improves, you do get a sense that Africa really does have a future and can follow Bangladesh and other countries. I think there's another related issue, and that is that it may be that we in the news media harp too much on the failures, that what we tend to do is cover the famines and not the places that are succeeding. And it may be that disproportion. There's a debate in journalism about this question. I mean, if part of it is that we tend to cover the planes that crash, not the planes that take off, and we do the same for countries. We cover countries that crash, not countries that take off. But it may be that this emphasis on doom and gloom does paint a picture that is not only unrepresentative of the mosaic as a whole, but perhaps is also not always helpful to the larger continent. I also think that to the extent that Africa does face some real problems, we have to acknowledge that we are part of those problems, and climate change is the biggest example. That climate change is a huge challenge for Africa in the coming decades, and part of that is that if you have certain fragility in countries already, then if the rainfall doesn't come, in Atlanta, there are coping mechanisms. If rain doesn't come in Burundi, then people die. And Africa is not producing any carbon emissions to speak of. Their rainfalls are affected because of our carbon emissions. And it's obviously very difficult to gauge, and there's a lot of uncertainty. But it may well be that our carbon emissions are vastly dwarfing the assistance that we have provided. Another point that I think is people often feel is, well, Africa is torn apart by tribalism. And the problems there arise from one tribe persecuting another tribe and so on. I think for starters, maybe the one point to note is that if Africa were looking at our history, they would say, well, yeah, what was that Holocaust about? Wasn't that about, the Christian tribe killing the Jewish tribe? Or, people do perceive things in different ways. And even within Africa, I think that we sometimes tend to exaggerate the degree to which the problem is tribalism, as opposed to awful governance or, evil, if you will. In Darfur, the government says that the problem is tribalism. They acknowledge that there have been killings, and they say it's not genocide, it's not the government, it's one tribe killing another tribe. I'm going to show you a video later, and some of the scenes I'll show you are from a village called Tama that I had gone to in Darfur, and the government-backed militia, the Janjaweed, had killed 50 people in Tama, and including grabbing kids from the arms of the mothers and killing them in front of them. And as I was driving back from Tama to the town of Niala, where I was spending the night, I was on a main road with checkpoints, and I saw, who should I see but a convoy of these Janjaweed, this Janjaweed militia that is responsible for the killings. And the Janjaweed goes sailing through these government checkpoints, and it's clear they're all buddy-buddy, that the government is facilitating their travel. Meanwhile, at one of the checkpoints, I got stopped, and I was with a photographer and a translator. The translator was a 19-year-old kid who I'd found, because most of the English speakers have been snapped up by aid groups, and so I found this university student who spoke some English, and I'd hired him for a week to work for me. And the authorities at this checkpoint pulled him out, and they told us, oh, you drive along, nothing to do with you. We're just going to hold him for investigation. It sure seemed to us that the investigation was going to end 15 minutes later with a bullet in his head. And it was very scary. And we tried everything we could think of. We tried to bribe these guys to let him go. We tried befriending them. And finally we said, we just can't go without him. And so at that point they arrested us as well. They kept us all in a little detention hut, and it had a mural on the side of one man being held down and two others impaling him with a stake through the middle. And we were sitting there waiting, and there are a few places you would less want to spend time in than a Sudanese Darfuri detention hut with that image in front of you. But it's much more complicated to do terrible things to somebody with white skin and a blue passport, frankly. And so they called in their commander. Eventually their commander showed up, and he let us all go, including the driver. But to see the Janjaweed being waved through these checkpoints and then have the authorities try to arrest my interpreter just underscored to me the degree to which this isn't just random tribes killing each other. This is a government policy. And indeed, the Janjaweed, they're paid by the Sudanese government. They are given uniforms by the Sudanese government, and they call in air support to attack villages as well. Another issue that I think people sometimes feel is, well, there are needs there, but after all, we are doing a lot as it is. On the humanitarian aid front, I would just note that it is sometimes thought that our farm subsidies actually do about as much harm to African agricultural exporters as our aid does good for countries. And so it's approximately a wash. In the case of Darfur, it is true that President Bush actually has done more than most other leaders have done in the case of Darfur. I mean, I wish he would do much more. But on the relief side, the administration has done a pretty good job. If you are driven out of your village in Darfur and you can get to a refugee camp in Chad, you'll get plastic sheeting, and you'll get a doctor who can pry bullets out of you. But 4 years into this, I see every time I go out there, I see doctors carving bullets out of kids. And it's great that we're underwriting that medical work. But you also kind of think that this isn't an indefinite solution, that at some point there has to be a greater effort to stop the bullets from being fired in the first place. One of my friends, I have a friend, a young American woman, who's an aid worker in Darfur, and she saw some excruciating things there. And in particular, for a while, she was working in a village where the Janjaweed was still active. And she was trying to get the African tribes who were being killed by the Janjaweed to talk about it. And finally, she got two sisters to tell their story. And these two sisters told how about 50 of the Janjaweed had moved into this family's compound, this extended family's compound. And these Janjaweed had forced this African family, in effect, to be their slaves. They had to kill their animals to feed the Janjaweed. They had to go get water for the Janjaweed to drink. They had to cook for the Janjaweed. And in the case of these two sisters, they had to sleep with the Janjaweed. And then after several days of this, their father had worked up his courage and had gone to the commander of the Janjaweed, the commander of these 50 people who were in their compound, and had begged him and had gotten down on his knees and said, please, we'll do anything you want, but just let my daughters go. And at that point, the Janjaweed commander had called in the two sisters and had beheaded their father in front of them. And so my friend asked these two girls and said, well, what can we do for you? We have plastic sheeting, we've got food, we've got some medical supplies. What do you have? What do you need? What can we give you? And they just said, there's nothing you have that we want. We just want to die. And so after 4 years of this, you think it's great that we're supplying plastic sheeting and food and all the rest, but it seems so incredibly inadequate. A broader question is why the focus on genocide in particular? If you look at the number of people who've been killed in Darfur, it's probably been 500,000 or less, maybe substantially less. In contrast, we don't know, but for example, malaria kills somewhere between perhaps 1 million and 3 million people every year worldwide. And so to put the Darfur genocide figure in perspective, the 4-year death total in Darfur is less than the margin of error every year from malaria. And so one can make a case that, well, maybe we should be focusing on all these other immense needs all over rather than genocide. And, there are days when I do think that. But I've got to say that as somebody who has seen plenty of kids dying of malaria and everything else, nothing affects me more than going to Darfur and seeing parents who describe their children being thrown into bonfires because of a government policy based on the color of their skin or the tribe they belong to. And I think it's because fundamentally we have some kind of a moral compass that is moved in part by the degree of human suffering, but also in part by this word that seems dated, and that's evil. And, you go out to Darfur and there's no doubt that that's what's going on there. It's evil. And I think that's why Anne Frank's diary today has so much resonance. It's not the story of one girl who suffered and died. It's the story of a government that, as a matter of national policy, killed a girl because of what she represented. And that genocide, I think, represents this ultimate effort to tear apart the human fabric. And ultimately, the only way we assert our humanity is by trying to stand up to that. And then one gets to this difficult question of, well, why should we care? And one can try to formulate an answer to that based on our national interests. Sudan has oil. Chad, the neighboring country, which is falling apart, is an oil exporter as well. We get Chadian oil coming here. It's been shown that failed states, which is what Chad and Central African Republic are in great danger of becoming because of Darfur, that failed states harbor terrorism, they harbor disease, they send refugees all over, and they're also contagious. It's a tremendous contagion. The average failed state, one study found, imposes economic costs alone of about $100 billion. So you can argue that it's worth investing much more modest sums to try to prevent these. And I think those arguments are all true. I think we do have a national interest in trying to address these issues. But ultimately, at least to me, the argument that has the most resonance is that we not only have interests, but we also have values. And I think it's our values that are most affronted by the suffering that goes on in these countries, and maybe the most compelling reason to address these issues and all these humanitarian issues. As many of you know, one of the issues that has been close to my heart has been sex trafficking. And the reason that became a cause of mine was years ago in Cambodia. As a reporter, I went into a brothel and met these two girls and interviewed them, spent an afternoon interviewing them, a 15-year-old and a 14-year-old. The 14-year-old had been sold by her stepfather. The 15-year-old had been kidnapped and sold to the brothel. And they were locked up. And they were slaves, as much as 19th century slaves. The difference was they were going to be dead of AIDS by their early 20s. And the 15-year-old's mother had, in fact, after traveling all around trying to find her daughter, had finally, a week earlier, found that girl in that brothel. And so I asked, well, why didn't your mother take you away then and rescue you? And she said, the brothel owner said he'd paid good money for me, and my mother could buy me back, but my mother didn't have the money. And I said, well, couldn't she go to the police? And, again, what a naive American. Of course, the brothel owners are paying the police. And so if the girls tried to escape, the police would arrest them and take them right back to the brothel. And, so you build these connections with individuals and you see these stories, and then suddenly these larger issues have a broader meaning, and you want to address them. And, my aim today is not only to help you, I hope, understand some of these issues, but also to try to galvanize you and encourage you to action. And I hope that afterward you will, for example, on the issue of Darfur, go to a website like SaveDarfur.org, or Genocide Intervention Network is active there, or some of the relief groups, not least of which, CARE here in Atlanta does fantastic work, and Helene Gale, the head of it, is here. I've seen CARE's work on the ground, and it's awesome. It's incredibly inspiring. But I think the best way of building those connections is precisely to show you some images of what Darfur does look like these days. And half of me kind of wants to apologize ahead of time for images that in some cases are pretty graphic and disturbing. But after 4 years of this, I guess I've decided to stop apologizing, because that's what Darfur looks like. And I think the only way to shake people up is to show them just how awful things really are out there. You can see this image here. I became, it's obviously unusual for a New York Times columnist to bounce into the same sort of remote, obscure part of the world like Darfur time and again. In my case, it happened because on one of my first trips, I was out and I reached an oasis, this place, on the Chad-Sudan border. There were 30,000 people who had fled their villages in Darfur and had taken shelter in this oasis. And there were trees, since it's basically a desert area, so they were sheltering under trees. And so I did what a journalist does. I went from tree to tree talking to people. This young man was under the first tree, and he'd been shot in the neck and in the jaw when the Janjaweed attacked his village and left in a pile of bodies along with his parents. His brother had been only shot in the leg and had been able to run away. At night, the brother returned to the village and wanted to bury his parents and the brother, found that the brother was still alive, carried him on his back for 49 days through the desert to get him to this oasis, thinking that he could then get help. Well, that was the first tree. And then this was the very next tree. This is a woman who, her parents had been killed in front of her and then thrown into the village well to poison the water so that nobody else could farm that, could inhabit that village afterward. Then her husband had initially survived. The Janjaweed had tracked them down and killed her husband and other menfolk in her clan, and she had taken this child and two other children to this oasis. They were the second tree. Under the third tree were these two kids. Their parents and older siblings had been killed, and they had been left alone in the world. this 5-year-old girl looking after her 1-year-old baby sister, and there they were. I should say that I went back later and was able to find these same kids, and they were doing much better. And again, I think that's also one answer to this issue of hopelessness, that we think that our efforts aren't really making a difference because the killing does go on. But you've got to also remember that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are alive today who wouldn't be if there hadn't been all those Save Darfur posters. And those 2 kids are alive today for precisely that reason, that the Janjaweed doesn't attack their camp, because it's concerned that Sudan is concerned that if it were to do that, that would be one step over the line. There would be, the protests would be too great. So those protests really do, they do make a difference, and those 2 kids are examples of that difference that they make. Under the next tree, we have this woman, Zahra. Her husband was killed in front of her. Her 2 small kids had been pulled out of her arms, killed in front of her. Then she and her 2 sisters had been kidnapped by the Janjaweed for a week. At the end of that, the 2 sisters had been killed. She had been left naked in the desert to wander back, and she'd been mutilated on the leg to stigmatize her forever as a rape victim, which has been a very common practice by the Janjaweed all across large areas. They call it marking the victim, to mark the victim, so that everybody will know that she is a rape victim, and to make the whole approach of terrorizing communities that much more effective. And I think what really got me was that those were the first 4 trees where I did interviews. And in every direction, as far as I looked, there were more trees and more people under them with stories just like theirs. And that was really the moment when, to me, both the brutality of the atrocities and their scale hit home to me. And after that, I've just found it very difficult to stay away from the issue when you know that Zahra is still out there, and those 2 kids are still out there, and people are still going through these issues after 4 years. This genocide in slow motion. It's really hard to turn away from that. These are some images from Darfur. These are still images. Most of them were taken by a guy called Brian Steidel, who is a U.S. military observer there. These are Janjaweed right there. There's a movie called Devils on Horseback, a documentary, which is a very powerful documentary about Brian Steidel's work, and I heartily recommend it. This guy, a moment ago, that guy had been castrated, which happens a lot. This kid her head had been bashed in, another kid killed. Brian leaked these photos to me just because he was so frustrated. He's an observer and has to put up with all these things. This you see the handcuffs there. This was a girls' school, a Saleha girls' school, and the Janjaweed attacked and handcuffed the girls, and we don't know, but there's a widespread presumption that they were probably raped and then burned. And it's been common for the Janjaweed to burn people alive. This is a woman I met in the biggest camp, or what was then the biggest camp in Darfur, Kalma camp. She had lived a comfortable middle-class existence. And then the Janjaweed had attacked. They'd initially killed her husband. Then 8 of them had gang raped her. And she just thought, if only she can get through this, then if she can get to Kalma camp, then there are foreign aid workers there, and they will save her children. And so Magbula, she hiked through the desert with her children. The youngest, Abdul Halim, was just a little baby. She got there, and Abdul Halim was still alive, although barely. And at that point, Sudan was not the Sudanese government was not allowing new people to be registered at the camp to get supplies and to get attention. And so 3 days after she arrived at the camp, Abdul Halim died. And for somebody like that to talk about, the rape is incredibly courageous. At Kalma camp, women who reported rapes were often arrested for fornication or adultery, depending on whether they were married or unmarried. In fact, right before I talked to her, there had been a student named Hawa. And Hawa had been out gathering firewood, had been raped, was taken to a French clinic, Médecins du Monde, and the two nurses at Médecins du Monde, they were treating her, and somebody in the clinic apparently called the police and reported that this woman has reported a rape, is getting treatment. The police pulled up in several pickup trucks in front of the Médecins du Monde clinic. These two French nurses tried heroically to keep these police out, but they were pushed aside. And the police grabbed Hawa and took her to jail, and they handcuffed her. They chained her to a cot with one arm and one leg, and and then they arrested her for fornication. After that, of course, nobody was willing to try to get medical treatment for these rapes. There's also there are post-exposure prophylaxis kits, which reduce the risk of HIV transmission from a rape if they're administered promptly. Sudan, at that time at least, was preventing aid groups from bringing in post-exposure prophylaxis kits. The point to underscore is this is not rape that is incidental, as you sometimes see it, to upheavals and violence. This is a policy of rape by the Sudanese government to terrorize people. And for people like Magbula to talk about it, I just find incredibly inspiring. I talked earlier about the village of Tama, where coming back from Tama, I was stopped at this checkpoint. These are the survivors from Tama. They had been driven out. They'd gone to a village about 10 miles away, and they were kind of stuck here. They didn't know where to go. Then I went into Tama itself. This is the village, their village, which had been destroyed, and now it was just a grazing ground for camels of the Janjaweed. There was nobody in sight. And now you drive through Darfur, and you can drive for scores of miles, and you just see villages like that one. This is actually a village it's even spread into Chad and Central African Republic. And I find that one of the most depressing things, that not only did we not stand up to a government committing genocide against its own people, but we allowed it to spread in a neighboring country. This was in Chad. This village, a village called Bildik, had been attacked shortly before I arrived there that night. And what the Janjaweed hadn't realized was that there were some people in Bildik who did have weapons and shot back. And this young man had been shot in the back, and there's another person you'll see soon whose horse had been shot out from under him, and then he'd been hit with a machete. And then the Janjaweed fled when they realized the people had weapons, and they left these two behind. And you can see they're young, they're kids. They were paid to join the Janjaweed, I think again that also puts a lie to this notion of just sort of ideological hatreds or racial hatreds, that there is an element of that, but there's also an element of a government paying people to join the Janjaweed. This is the one whose horse had been shot out from under him, and then he'd been hit with machete, and he told about being paid to do this. I asked the villagers not to kill him, and indeed they didn't. They handed him over to the Chadian military, but he was put into jail, and then after that the Janjaweed freed they came through town, killed people, and let everybody out of the jail. And then later, the village of Bildik, that village, the Janjaweed came again a few days later with more people and wiped out the village. You know, you think you've seen the absolute worst things that can happen, and then on my last visit, I ran into this young man. It was the first time I'd seen this, but since then it's happened repeatedly. The Janjaweed catch somebody, and they hold him down, and they use their bayonets to gouge out his eyes. And I think they realized the effect of that, and so now it's something that they have done repeatedly on the Chad side of the border. And what you can't see here, but even more horrifying than this young man, is at the foot of the bed, his daughter is standing there, and she was about 5 years old, and she was looking at her dad with this look of, partly sympathy, but partly just utter horror, as if she was looking at a monster. And to see, any girl see her father with that look just broke my heart. This is a little hospital, and only the most seriously wounded like him were in the hospital. His sister, for example, had been shot in the shoulder, and she, like most people, were out in the courtyard on the grass outside, because if you're only shot in the shoulder, then you don't merit a bed, even in, two people to a bed in the hospital itself. I feel like I'm being incredibly depressing, and I sort of look out and I see everybody looking, utterly horrified. But I want to leave you with a couple of people who I think present a different and more inspiring thought. People periodically ask me, how can you do it? How can you go over and over to Darfur and hear these stories and see these things and still kind of hold your sanity? And it's because you do see and hear really terrible things, but side by side with that, you see the very best of humanity. And you see that in the form of these incredible aid workers. I bounce in for maybe a week. Those aid workers are there day in, day out, constantly. I mentioned earlier my friend, this American woman who was there, who had talked to these two sisters, and I was thinking of her over Thanksgiving, because after that particular time in Darfur, she had gone back to visit her family in the U.S., and she'd been at her grandmother's house, and she was telling me how she'd just been, and all in Darfur, she was an incredibly strong person who had just seen all these terrible things and had been just fine. And then she got back to her grandmother's house and was in the backyard and saw a bird feeder. And she just broke down. And she said that, after being in Darfur and seeing all these terrible things people are doing to each other, and then to be in a backyard in America and see people, put out bird food for birds so they'll get by a little bit better for the winter, that was more than she could handle. And so, the aid workers, the Darfuris themselves, the local people who were involved in relief efforts, who were trying to put together a peace where it seems impossible to cobble together, they inspire me more than the Janjaweed leave me depressed. So somehow I managed to come back from Darfur in a very strange way, actually feeling that there really is, that there is some fundamental decency and humanity. And it's people like this who leave me with that. This man, he'd been married forever to a woman that he and his wife were very, very close. His wife is lame, and she could not run when the Janjaweed attacked her village. And so when the Janjaweed attacked, everybody else was fleeing. he refused to run and leave his wife behind. And so the Janjaweed caught them, and they knocked him to the ground, and they lit a bonfire on his back. And his wife, who could barely walk, was pleading with them and was trying to pull them off. And, of course, they were just knocking her to the ground. But finally, she jumped on top of the bonfire and tried to put out the fire with her own body. And at that, the Janjaweed, I think, really got sort of embarrassed. And they said, oh, he'll die anyway. And they went and left him. And she was able to put out the fire. And she saved him. His name was Yahya. And so, he stood up for her, and then she stood up for him. And so the burns are being scraped off. And, of course, there's no anesthetic. But he's alive because of her. The Janjaweed have AK-47s and RPGs. These guys have bows and arrows to try to fight the Janjaweed off. The Janjaweed came back and wiped out that village. This woman, she's like Yahya. She's the kind of person who just really leaves me feeling good about humanity. Her name is Suad. And she was from Darfur and was driven out in the early stages of attacks. And she knew all about these rapes, which are very much a part of the policy. I think the Sudanese government decided very early that if you kill people, you produce these embarrassing piles of bodies. If you rape people, it's just as effective to terrorize populations and drive them out. And it doesn't leave, people don't talk about it, so there's less to explain. So Suad knew all about that because her next-door neighbor family, there was a young girl, she's 11 or 12, who'd been kidnapped by the Janjaweed for a week, and her legs had been pulled apart, and so she was crippled. And so every day, Suad sees that neighbor girl and limping around and knows about the horror of the Janjaweed rapes. Suad, then she was out with her younger sister, Halima, whom she just adores. They were outside their camp. They'd fled into Chad at this point, but gradually the Janjaweed had followed them into Chad because the international community didn't prevent that. And so the Janjaweed were circling the camp, and when the women went out to get firewood, they were sometimes attacking them. Suad was with Halima, and they saw the Janjaweed coming. Suad told Halima, "You run to the camp, run back to camp, and I'll make a diversion." And that's what she did. Suad ran in the other direction, very visibly, and the Janjaweed turned and ran after her and caught her, and Halima was able to get back to the camp unscathed. And Suad was caught and gang raped by 8 people and brutally beaten. But then she, as you can see, she was also willing to appear on video and to tell the story, despite the incredible stigma of rape and the risk of punishment by the Sudanese. If people like Suad are going to stay alive, it's at the end of the day not going to be because leaders in Washington are taking the initiative, but it's going to be because people, like all of us, are putting the pressure on them. Thank you very much. Most people can't just jump on a plane and gallivant off to these places. So, what can they realistically do? And I think that there are a couple of things. One is that I really do think it is important, actually, to encourage travel as much as possible. And it seems to me that one of the shortcomings of university education in America today is that it's possible for people to go through 4 years of university and know more about ancient Rome, perhaps, than about how, about 1/3 of the world lives today. And I think it's so important, actually, to get people out and spend some time in the developing world. It seems to me that if you look at Iraq, for example, that the biggest intelligence failure there didn't have to do with WMD, but rather it was the assumption that Iraqis were going to welcome us with flowers. And I think that if there were more Americans who had spent time in villages almost anywhere, whether in the Middle East or in Latin America, then they would, appreciate that people often see America through a prism of suspicion that would make them, be a little skeptical about this notion that we'd be welcome. So I think that there should be much more of an effort to encourage travel, not just for the sake of helping people in developing countries, but for the sake of our own understanding of the world. Everybody in Darfur is Muslim. There was a separate North-South war in Sudan in which that was religious to some degree, northern Muslims against southern Christians and animists. But in Darfur, everybody is Muslim. There, the tension is, in a sense, threefold. One is Arabs versus non-Arabs, and then in addition, the Arab population tends to be lighter skinned, and the African tribes tend to be darker skinned. So there is an element of skin color, although one can exaggerate it. And in addition, occupational, that in general the Arabs tend to be nomadic herdsmen, and the African tribes tend to be settled farmers. And so you have some of that herdsman versus farmer conflict that has been around forever. On top of that, you also had competition for scarce resources, and there's some reason to think that may be associated with climate change. The climate models show that one would expect a drying of the area as you get higher carbon densities, and whether for that reason or just by coincidence, there has indeed been a drying of the area. I think that one can exaggerate the degree. I don't think this is a consequence of climate change. I think this is a consequence of a genocidal government in Sudan. But you had these conflicts between the tribes, and the African tribes are the Zagawa, the Masalit, and the Fur. And there was an incipient rebellion by those African tribes in 2003, and then the Sudanese government basically decided to resolve this, to come up with a military solution. And the Sudanese government, they're not Taliban-style extremists. They simply thought, as a practical measure, this was a remote area, people wouldn't particularly notice, and that the most effective way to deal with the insurgency was to slaughter people in rural areas. And and they started doing that, and to some degree, it worked. And there hasn't been much protest, partly because it's hard to get to, partly because it's a long way from anywhere. And in terms of the differences from Bosnia, it seems to me that it sure helps if genocide victims are white and European in terms of generating a response. But we didn't do so great in Bosnia either, so I wouldn't want to take that too far. But the big problem in generating international response has been China. China is on the Security Council and has blocked effective action. China gets oil from Sudan and in exchange supplies weapons to Sudan. Now, ultimately, I think that if China were to put pressure on Sudan, were to say, look, we're not going to transfer arms to you unless you really negotiate seriously for a peace in Darfur, then I think at that point Sudan would be willing to make the concessions that would achieve a peace there. And I think a peace in Darfur is soluble, but I'm afraid that there isn't going to be enough pressure, it's not going to be achieved, and that in fact what we're going to see that Darfur is going to be remembered merely as the prologue to something much bloodier, and that's going to be a revival of the North-South War, which had killed 2 million people. And if that revives, and I think there's a reasonable chance that it will, you could see another 2 million people dying there, and maybe that would take away the title from the Congo of the world's bloodiest conflict. And to see all this happening in slow motion, there's a film that's going to be, a documentary that's going to be on HBO, I believe next Friday, called Sand and Sorrow, about Darfur. And they raised the question at the beginning, which I think is a good one, that the world didn't respond to earlier genocides, whether the Holocaust or Rwanda. And so what if it were to happen in slow motion to give everybody more time to respond? And now we have the answer. It's an issue that I struggle with constantly. In the case of those brothels buying these two girls, what happened was, after I had interviewed these two girls, these 14-year-old and the 50-year-old that I talked about earlier, and I spent an afternoon with them, and I walked out of that brothel knowing that I had a good front page story and knowing that they were going to stay behind and die of AIDS. And it felt like a really unequal, exploitative relationship for two girls who were being exploited every day in one way or another. And so when I went back as a columnist, I really didn't want to have that same kind of unequal transaction, if you will. And so I asked the Times lawyers, do we have any policy on buying human beings? And turns out we didn't. So I ended up later as a columnist, buying two individuals, and one for I think $150, one for $200. I got receipts from their owners, which just kind of blew my mind that you could buy a human being and get a receipt for them. And I'm still in touch with both of those girls. And you're right, some people thought, journalists shouldn't be doing that. I would also say that I don't think that buying girls out of brothels is a real solution to the problem, because essentially it raises the market price of girls and creates more incentive for somebody else to kidnap girls and to sell them to the brothels. I thought that it would, doing that, taking them back to their village, would enable me to also to sort of create this process that I would write about and get people engaged in the issue, and that was to some degree how I justified the economics of it. But there are constantly these very difficult sort of journalistic issues, and on Darfur I dance around it. There was a big rally in Washington about Darfur. I did not go to that because speaking at a rally or attending a rally just seemed a little bit kind of over the line, and seemed a little more political. But I come pretty close to that line a great deal. One time in China, there was maybe one of the toughest decisions I've ever had to make. When my wife and I were based in China, there was a young man from Tsinghua University who had helped us cover Tiananmen. And afterward, partly because he had helped us, he ended up in prison. He escaped from prison, and then he came and asked for our help in fleeing from China. The one thing that is pretty clear for foreign correspondents is you don't help escaped felons flee the country. And yet, here was a kid who, if we hadn't helped him, at some point he was going to get caught again. He would, his life would be utterly ruined. He'd end up in prison forever. And my wife and I just agonized over that. And finally, we did help him. And he got to the U.S. He's now in the U.S. And it was profoundly unprofessional, but it also really feels like the right thing to do. I think that when I try to weigh these decisions, I try to imagine them kind of on a billboard that, okay, Kristof, helps kid escape from China. After that kid, help report on issue. That I can sort of live with. There are some other things that seem a little bit over that line. the toughest journalistic issue, in a sense, actually has been some of these people, the rape victims, what to do with their names and images. There's been a lot of really interesting work in the field of psychology about how you build a connection with people, what moves people to action. And one of the lessons is that if you ask people to donate to a cause, then they don't. If you ask people to donate to an individual, then they will. And ironically, if you ask them to donate to an individual, but you say it's part of a larger cause, then they don't want to do that either. They donate less than if it's to the cause. It's those individual people want to help individuals. They don't want to help issues. And so I know that if I'm writing about rape in Darfur, for example, I'm going to get people indignant if I write about individuals, if I tell that story through individuals. But in the case of Darfur, if I do that through an individual, then that may be great in putting pressure on Sudan to reduce a policy of rape. It may get that individual arrested by the Sudanese government. You can't imagine the things that could happen to her children, to her family, as well as just the stigma that goes on. And, these things also live in cyberspace forever. And I can't tell you how much I've sort of agonized about that trade-off. And if it's a political prisoner, for example, a dissident, there's a prominent Sudanese dissident called Mudawi, and when I quote him as saying nasty things about the government, I always wonder if I'm going to get him killed. But Mudawi, he knows what he's doing. He's taking these risks, but he knows what it means to be quoted in the New York Times, and he's willing to do it, and I'm not going to be paternalistic and say, no, I'm not going to quote you for that reason. But these rape victims, they don't know what it means to be quoted, to have their picture on a website. They don't know what a website is. And so there's no such thing as informed consent. You've got to make that decision for them. And what do we do after a lot of agonizing? What we've done is I use a name, but I only use one name. So Magbula, for example, there are 1 billion Magbulas in Kalma camp. We shot that against, you saw just a dirt background, so they can't figure out what part of the camp she's in. There are 90,000 people in the camp. I don't know how many Magbulas there are. The police also don't have easy access inside the camp. We don't run the victim's voice, because that will tell you what ethnic group, whether she's speaking Zagawa or Masalit or Fur. Ideally, if they don't know, and especially we don't say what village he came from, because the camps are organized by the village that they fled from. And so, our sense and our hope is that if we have their name, Magbula, and an age, that is not going to be enough. An age seems much more precise to American readers, but to Sudanese, ages are very vague. That it gives a verisimilitude, and the image gives a verisimilitude that is going to move Americans, but isn't going to be enough to get the police. After every trip, I am just terrified that I'm drawing those trade-offs wrongly, and that I'm going to get somebody like Magbula, arrested and tortured, killed, whatever, and ruin the life of her children as well. And that is an incredibly tough responsibility, and it's one of the things I find most difficult about Darfur, this notion of putting other people at risk. partly just utter horror, as if she was looking at a monster. To see, any girl see her father with that look just broke my heart. This is a little hospital, and only the most seriously wounded, like him, were in the hospital. His sister, for example, had been shot in the shoulder, and she, like most people, were out in the courtyard on the grass outside, because if you're only shot in the shoulder, then you don't merit a bed, even in, two people to a bed in the hospital itself. And I sort of look out and I see everybody looking, utterly horrified. But I want to leave you with a couple of people who I think present a different and more inspiring thought. People periodically ask me, how can you do it? How can you go over and over to Darfur and hear these stories and see these and still kind of hold your sanity? And it's because you do see and hear really terrible things, but side by side with that, you see the very best of humanity in the form of these incredible aid workers. I bounce in for maybe a week. Those aid workers are there day in, day out, constantly. I mentioned earlier my friend, the American, who was there, who had talked to these two sisters, and I was thinking of her over Thanksgiving, because after that particular time in Darfur, she had gone back to visit her family in the U.S., and she'd been at her grandmother's house, and she was telling me how she'd just been, and all in Darfur, she was an incredibly strong person who had done terrible things and had been just fine. And then she got back to her grandmother's house and was in the backyard and saw a bird feeder. And she just broke down. And she said that, after being in Darfur and seeing all these terrible things people are doing to each other, and then to be in a backyard and see people, put out bird food for birds so they'll get by a little bit better for the winter, that was more than she could handle. And so, the aid workers, the Darfuris themselves, the local people who were involved in relief efforts, who were trying to put together a peace where it seems impossible to cobble together, they inspire me more than the Janjaweed leave me depressed. So somehow I managed to come back from Darfur in a very strange way, actually feeling that there really is, that there is some fundamental decency in humanity. And it's people like this who leave me with that. This man, he'd been married forever to, he and his wife were very, very close. His wife is lame, and she could not run when the Janjaweed attacked her village. And so when the Janjaweed attacked, everybody else was fleeing. He refused to run and leave his wife behind. And so the Janjaweed caught them, and they knocked him to the ground, and they lit a bonfire on his back. Who could barely walk was pleading with them and was trying to pull them off, and of course they were just knocking her to the ground. But finally jumped on top of the bonfire and tried to put out the fire with her own body. And at that, the Janjaweed, I think, really got, he'll die anyway, and they were able to put out the fire, and she saved him. His name was Yahya, and so he stood up for her, and then she stood up for him, and so the burns are being scraped off, and of course there's no anesthetic, but he's alive because of her, the Janjaweed have AK-47s and RPGs. These guys have bows and arrows to try to Janjaweed off. The Janjaweed came back and wiped out. This woman, she's like Yahya. She's the kind of person who just really leaves me feeling good about humanity. Her name is Suad. And she was from Darfur and with stages of attacks. And she knew all about these rapes, which are very much a part of the policy. You know, I think the Sudanese government decided very early that if you kill people, you produce these embarrassing piles of bodies. If you rape people, it's just as effective to terrorize populations and drive them out. And it doesn't leave, you know, people don't talk about it, so there's less to explain. And so Suad knew all about that because her next door neighbor family, there was a young girl, she's 11 or 12, who'd been kidnapped by the Janjaweed for a week, and her leg crippled. And so every day, Suad sees that neighbor girl and limping around, and knows about the horror of the Janjaweed rapes. Well, Suad, then she was out with her younger sister Halima, whom she just adores. They were outside their camp. They fled into this point, but gradually the Janjaweed had followed them into Chad because the international community didn't prevent that. And so the Janjaweed were circling the camp, and when the women went out to get firewood, they were sometimes attacking them. Suad was with Halima, and they saw the Janjaweed coming. Halima, you run to the camp, run back to camp, and I'll make a diversion. And that's what she did. Suad ran in the other direction, very visibly, and the Janjaweed turned and ran after her. And Halima was able to get back to the camp unscathed. And Suad was caught and brutally beaten. But then she, as you can see, she was also willing to appear on video and to tell the story, despite the incredible stigma of rape and the risk of punishment by the Sudanese. If people like Suad are going to stay alive, it's at the end of the day not going to be because leaders in Washington are taking the initiative, but it's going to be because people are putting the pressure on them. Thank you very much.